मेरी ज़मीं महबूब मेरी मेरी नस नस में तेरा इश्क बहे फीका न पड़े कभी रंग तेरा जिस्मों से निकल के कूद
We will not tolerate terrorism, cross-border terrorism.
तेरी मिट्टी में मिल जावा गुल बन के मैं खिल जावा इतनी सी है दिल की आरज़ू तेरी नदियों में बह जावा तेरे खेतों में लहरावा इतनी सी है दिल की आरज़ू
हो
The title for this session is The Blurred Line Between Epics and History. We have amongst us a panel of distinguished and eminent resource persons. We welcome the moderator for the session, Ms Kajari Kamal, Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan, Lieutenant General Harinder Singh, and Mr. Sanjeev Chopra.
I'd like to welcome you all to this session, sir. Thank you so much. And we look forward to a very insightful session. The context has been set by the inaugural session, a very spirited, myth-busting, inspiring speeches by Mr. Darshan Singh and His Excellency, the Governor of Uttarakhand. I think the stage is all set. So we'll have the syndicate presentations before we get on with this session.
Today, I stand before you to discuss the enduring relevance of the Mahabharata, one of the world's oldest and most revered epic tales. Let us consider the importance of strategy in Mahabharata. The epic recounts the epic battle of Kurukshetra, where two mighty armies clashed. In this narrative, we find lessons on the strategic use of terrain, intelligence gathering, and resource management. The Mahabharata underscores the significance of alliances and diplomacy. The formation of alliances, such as the Pandavas securing the support of Lord Krishna, showcases the importance of building coalitions in military endeavors. This mirrors the contemporary practice of forging alliances and partnerships to enhance military capabilities and achieve common objectives.
The Mahabharata, with its central theme of dynastic war, provides insight into the cause and consequences of conflict and teaches the importance of dialogue, diplomacy, and non-violent conflict resolutions. In the today's world, these lessons can help in encourage peace and understanding.
According to history, Buddhism manifested somewhere around the 5th century BCE. So, what was Buddhism all about, which became so prominent in the years to come? It was simple, and it revolved around compassion, non-violence, and tolerance. There are several stories associated with Buddhism, and a major one which links to my state, Sikkim, is about how Sikkim embraced Buddhism as its state religion. The legend goes that Guru Padmasambhava, who was considered to be the second Buddha, blessed the land and foretold that the first king of Sikkim would be a person named Funsok, who would come from the east. This prediction, years later, came to be true when 3 monks came from different directions and came across a simple farmer milking cows near Gangtok, the capital of this state, and who was later coronated as the king in the year 1642. He was said to have the vision of a Buddhist deity, and thereby he established Buddhism as a state religion of Sikkim.
They had their origins about 2500 years ago when Prince Siddhartha, the Buddha, attained enlightenment at the age of 35, and when Vardhamana abandoned all worldly possessions at the age of 30. Buddha was a god. Okay, so firstly, Buddha was not a god, nor he did ever claim to be the one. He was a normal man who attained enlightenment through his own efforts. Buddhists worship God. Unlike many religions, Buddhism is not about worshipping idols or a person. It is all about following a path, which is the reason why Buddhism is considered to be more of a philosophy, not a religion.
Dharma arth kam mokshanam Upadesham samanvitam Purvrittam kathayuktam itihasam prachate, which means scriptures which guide us to the attainment of dharma, arth, kam, moksha, which include both actual events and stories, are called itihas. Furthermore, talking about the 2 epics of India, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which are the epic poem forming the Hindu itihas.
Here, when we say that the two of them form Hindu Itihas, we clearly mean that they are factual and had happened in past. If we talk about the level of importance of epics and ancient history, so it's not surprising to know that they both are equally important for our community.
The word itihas, that is history, can be seen in two ways, spiritual and scientific. In the scientific way, there has to be archaeological evidence, data, and so on for something to be considered as a fact. However, in the spiritual way, itihas means people's memory. In pure philosophical terms, it means this is how life is. So, itihas can be seen through aspect of belief, science, spirituality. India, being one of the oldest civilizations in the world, has a long and complex history that spans generations. However, as we delve deeper into the ancient past, we find that historical accounts and mythical narratives somewhere tend to intertwine together, creating confusion and blurring what exactly in history and what is mythology.
Mythology is about god, goddesses, demons, whereas history is about kingdoms and dynasties ruling over them. Indian mythology, often dismissed as mere fantasy, offers valuable insight into ancient history. The epic text of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, for instance, provide us with a unique perspective on India's past. These narratives, while containing supernatural elements, also contain geographical and historical references that align with the archaeological findings. One remarkable example is the city of Dwarka. Mentioned in the Mahabharata as Lord Krishna's abode, the city he ruled over, recent underwater archaeological discoveries of the coast of Gujarat have unveiled the submerged remains of an ancient city believed to be Dwarka, confirming its existence and suggesting that the text may have roots in historical reality.
According to what I feel, the perception of mythology and history, and somewhere there is a blurred line. Something that can be clarified as history has to be something that is not necessarily related to supernatural beings or supernatural powers. For example, the Mahabharata. I consider that mythology because towards the end, the Pandavas went in the Himalayas to climb and therefore climb a stairway to heaven, which is just not feasible in the real world, and that's why I do not classify that as history. And the leaders that I will be talking about today are Porus and Alexander. We've already seen about Mahabharata, Ramayana, Buddhism and Jainism, but these are two rulers which I think we really need to incorporate in our history and we really need to learn about them. Porus and Alexander were historical figures who lived during ancient times. They were prominent figures in the events surrounding the conquests of Alexander the Great primarily. Porus, whose actual name might have been Puru, we still do not know, because this is where the fact of the bloodline comes into play, where written records were very rarely kept, so we do not exactly know what is actually true or what might not be true. So his actual name might have been Puru, and he was an ancient Indian king who ruled a region corresponding to the parts of modern-day Punjab, Pakistan and India. He is most famous for the encounter with Alexander the Great during the latter's conquests in the Indian subcontinent. Alexander was born in 356 BCE. He was a Macedonian king and a military commander. He ascended the throne after the assassination of his father, King Philip II, and embarked on a series of conquests that eventually created one of the largest empires in ancient history. Porus and Alexander were two significant figures for ancient history, with Porus being an Indian king known for his resistance against Alexander, and Alexander being a Macedonian conqueror known for his remarkable military campaigns and expansive empire.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the delegates for very perceptive presentations and for bringing out the essence and the emotion of what this session promises to hold. Epics, as we all know, are stories, legends, myths. Etymologically, the term myth comes from a Greek term, mythos, which means stories of gods and heroes. History, on the other hand, is a documented fact. It's a factual account of human history. In India, interestingly, and has been vividly brought out by the presentations, the two melt into each other. So the sources of history for us are as much pieces of literature, architectural remains, coins, pottery, as are the symbols, beliefs, and rituals perpetuated by the stories of the epics. The folklore tradition in India has perhaps popularized these stories of the epics far greater in terms of impact than the written, sequential, documented history has. And a good example of it is, in the speech which Mr. Darshan Singh gave us in the morning, he told us about if you go to a person on the road and ask him about what unfolded in the years 1962, 65, 71, and we wouldn't really get an answer. And that's a fact. And on the other hand, we had His Excellency, the Governor, talk about the Lakshman Rekha. He used it a couple of times in his speech, and he didn't have to explain what it meant because all of us perfectly understand what Lakshman Rekha is. In the words of the External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, the Mahabharata, which is one of the epics, has the most vivid distillation of Indian strategic thought, which has endured into the present. And while these politico-military ideas which are ensconced in these epics have evolved over the centuries, with shifts of emphasis in terms of policy prescriptions, adapting to the changing reality, the broad strategic framework has remained unchanged.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here. I'm a bit surprised that I'm on this panel when I have no grounding in history or mythology. But let me say that history and mythology has had a very dichotomous relationship. History is what is believed, and mythology is what is believed to have happened. History is about people, about events, about places. History is about the earthly observations. Well, mythology is also about earthly observations, but I would say mythology is also about certain supranatural events or observations or thoughts or narratives. So I think what is important for these young fellows who are here is to understand how do we go about distinguishing between history and mythology, where lines of history and mythology intersect each other, and as we grow up, what do we privilege first? Do we look at history first and then mythology, or we concurrently look at history and mythology? So I think that's a challenge that we have, because when we look at history, it's all about consistency. It's all about authenticity. Well, it's also about interpretations, and those interpretations get questioned over a period of time. There is a degree of pluralism to history, but the larger issue is that there is a way how we look at history, and there is a way how we look at mythology. So therefore, I think it's extremely important for all these young children here to understand in what manner do we grow up. We end up with a few half-truths of history and the other half-truths of mythology, and then grow up as future leaders with quite a muddled understanding of all this. If you were to look back at the Greek mythology, obviously from the Greek mythology, a lot of their sentiments get reflected in the modern age. We talk about Greek art and culture, their architecture, and several other issues. When we look at the imperial Chinese thought, well, much of that flows that into what they do now. So obviously there are lines of intersection. Whether those lines of intersection lie in the larger area of political thought or religious thought or strategic thought, I think we need to find that common ground. Thank you.
Good afternoon, friends. You see, the interesting thing about both epic, myth, and history is that they all flow into each other. And the most recent example would be the fact that during the G20, India was called Bharat. And that led to a lot of controversy on whether India is India or whether India is Bharat or whether India is Hindustan. But that's a very common thing. The current subject of debate today in our country has been on whether India is India or whether India is Bharat. And that is where I want to show you, or I want to illustrate, that these lines can never get blurred. These lines continue to exist. For example, when the Constituent Assembly was debating on the very first article of the Indian Constitution, Dr. Ambedkar had said, and Jawaharlal Nehru had agreed with him, that it is India that is Bharat. The amendments that were moved said that no, it should be Bharat that is India or Hind that is India. These were amendments that were moved by Mr. M.V. Kamath and many others. I'll come to that later. But the important point to note is that while what happened in the epics is a part of the epoch, but the debates in the Constituent Assembly are part of history. Thus, when Mr. Kamath or when said Govind Sarup or when Kamalapati Tripathi, they said that India should have the name Bharat because this was the name that was accepted in Shanti Parv. This is the name that was there in Mahabharat. This is the name which was, given to the son of Dushyant and by the Mahakavi, the Mahakavya, Shakuntalam. So that is all part of recorded history today. So where exactly do we draw the line? I would in fact question, do we need to draw a line? Because life is all about the present continuous. And some of these things which as these brilliant presentations which the syndicate showed us, the lived history of a country. The lived history of a country is always in the present continuous. So as we go along, we'll discuss more on this. But I think what was once a part of epic can also be part of contemporary history and will continue to define the way we look at ourselves.
I want to take some departure from my esteemed colleagues here and focus upon what the moderator asked, which is, can we tell you about what I think about the topic itself? So we've heard many variants and many nuances of the myth that young minds are somehow undeveloped minds, dumb minds, and that we can only interact with them if we ourselves dumb down our conversations and the complexity of thought. And I think that this is deeply insulting to all of you who are sitting here. So for me, the fact that the Welham Boys' successive editions of the military history seminar occur at the school level without asking anybody to dumb down any part of what we are saying is a remarkable and extremely commendable feature of this. I really think that. Anybody who thinks that we need to dumb down and talk in Totala, let me know after this. So I am therefore very happy that we're talking not only to the young boys, because this is Welham Boys School, but I'm delighted that the most provocative comments that have come so far are from the young ladies. I have had the privilege of being the commandant of the Indian Naval Academy at Erimala, and I can tell you that in my experience, women tend to be several orders of magnitude ahead of their male counterparts. So all the ladies who are here, however young and however old, in case you agree with me, please make some noise. No, that is clapping. Make some noise. So, thank you. Let me begin by trying to distinguish between ancient mythology, myths, and modern myths, or what I would like to call urban myths. Many of these myths are created by the government of India. Successive governments of India. I am not discussing one or another party of India. One is that India or Bharat as a geopolitical entity existed in which we Indians, we fought against one another. We didn't worry. Instead of uniting against some foreigner, we actually frittered away our energy. Haven't you heard this myth? Why is it a myth? Because the last time that there was a geopolitical entity called India prior to 1947 and the British arrival was all the way back in 322 BCE, when Chandragupta Maurya's successors, Bindusara, whom nobody talks about, and the blue-eyed boy of history, namely Ashoka, ended up bringing all of India under one central rule. But after that, there is no other evidence of India under central geopolitical rule as opposed to socio-cultural entities. It's exactly like Europe. There was no concept of Europe. There was no concept of Italy. There was no concept of Germany. There were kingdoms. And therefore, if the kingdom of Kochi decided to wage conflict against the kingdom of Kollam, it was just Kochi versus Kollam. And if Kochi could be assisted by somebody external to them, great. There was no concept of a larger geopolitical entity. My other last point, what we need to distinguish between is history and historiography. Historiography is what is written. History can be maukhik. I can talk to you about history. I can tell you this or that or the other happened. Historiography is really important. Now, the question is, what do you do if the historiography is weak? You create what is called the grand narrative, the grand historical narrative. This is what the United States of America did. It didn't have a historiography, so it had to create one. And therefore, riverine forces became oceanic forces. We had to create these, they had to create these heroes. And when you are on to this kind of grand narrative, what you're doing is you're into romance. You're creating the romance of history without necessarily going into the history itself. So last point here is that generally this is part of a, an ascending process from a poorer background to a richer background. And if in India we are not able to distinguish this, and we're not able to understand how to utilize this for our future, then I'm afraid we're going to be stuck in relatively mundane arguments of whether the Mahabharata or the Ramayana will continue to guide modern thinking. Modern military thinking, as the governor said in the morning, is a lot to do with mathematics, not only to do with romance. Romance is essential. Don't have romance, you're really boring. But don't have mathematics, you're losing. And if you think that anything we're doing is expensive in terms of military force, try defeat. That's really expensive. So I just wanted to say that if you feel that India has sufficient historiography, then it doesn't need to create a grand historical narrative. If you feel that we don't have it, then we'd better create a grand historical narrative. And finally, we must get over this northern condescension that we possess. We condescend to people south of the Vindhyas. Let me give you a test. Khoob ladi mardani wo to? Brilliant. Rani Abbaka was? My point exactly. Jhansi ki Rani fought one battle, lost one battle. She was a football team. Her score would be played 1, 1-0, lost 1, points 0. Rani Abbaka of Mangalore or Uluru defeated the Portuguese navy, the Portuguese regulars, the Portuguese irregulars, the Portuguese amphibious forces for 14 years, defeating them year on year. But you don't know a single thing about them. We still have people who are telling us about Alexander the Great. How did you get this epithet, the Great? Who gave it to us? Terence Rattigan. Don't you think we ought to look at our history a bit better? And therefore, whether you come up here at the age of 8 or you come up here at the age of 80, get your fundamentals correct, because that is what will take us forward. Thank you very much.
Not in defiance with what the Admiral has just said, and here I'm talking about the formative text, there is this notion of something that we call a geocultural space, a sacred geography, a felt community. In the Arthashastra itself, it's called the Chakravartin Kshetra, which is referred to this area south of the Himalayas, north of the seas, about 1,000 yojanas west to east. I would like you, General, to tell us and tell the students about the evolution of this concept. How did it come to be established, especially highlighting the points of intersection between cultural and the natural landscape. And also, if you have the time, if you could just, tell us about whether you think there was this preoccupation with the land, because some of the travelers' accounts that we read, we see the Khyber Pass in the Hindu Kush mountains is seen as the gateway to this region called Indu. So to what extent do you think our ancient preoccupation with land, because most of the invasions came from that region, has permeated contemporary Indian strategic thinking?
Okay, so the relationship between natural and cultural landscapes, I understand. It's often said that geography drives history. If you go back in times, Herodotus once said that all history must be treated geographically and all geography must be treated historically. So, if you were to go back further in time, say to 3000, 4000 BC, the world at that point of time had about 4 major civilizations. If we were to count the major ones, starting with Mesopotamia, Egyptian civilization, Indus Valley civilization, and the Chinese civilization. And if we are not taking into account those 2 smaller civilizations that were there in the Americas, what we saw at that point of time was that each of these civilizations were based on a river valley system. And why a river valley system? For the simple reason that it afforded 3 things. One, that it provided people with fertile land. It gave them a high water table. It also gave them the right climate to grow up as people, as small communities, as tribes, as settlements, and all that put together. So we've seen that all these 4 civilizations over a period of time grew into strong settlements, into civilizations, and then build a huge amount of trade, and it then that trade spread amongst themselves over land and by sea, and that is how a kind of a drift of a cultural exchange took place between the civilizations. So these geocultural centers, if you were to say that, say the Mesopotamian civilization, or for that matter the Indus Valley civilization, they were initially isolated, but then over a period of time they started interacting with each other. So I would say that these were the initial steps or the ladder by which these areas grew. But what is important for us to note is that if you were to look at the Indian subcontinent, there was a different context. We largely carried a subcontinental context. If you look at the Mesopotamian civilization, they carried a different context which was both continental and maritime. In a sense, if we look at the Greco-Roman era, see how the knowledge of Mesopotamia traveled westwards and then incorporated the Greeks and the Romans, and then eventually as to how they came up right up to the banks of Indus River. So what I mean to say is that both these areas, both these geocultural regions grew up in a different manner. Now, when we look at the Indian subcontinent, I think it is very important for us to understand that Kautilyan geography, the geography of that time. And what was that? That was largely defined by the Palmer Knot. The Palmer Knot threw out 2 big ranges to the east and the west, notably the Greater Himalayas to the east and the Hindu Kush towards the west. We are not talking about the smaller ranges that were the Kunlun and the Tian Shan, which is beyond that. But this is the range that actually, in a way, kind of isolated India. So at that point of time, whatever cultural exchanges or influences that had to happen, we see that in the initial centuries took place along the Hindu Kush, which we don't remember, and along the Hindu Kush, largely the Khyber Pass. It is only much later that we learned that we had these Buddhist scholars coming from China, which walked through the Wakhan corridor and further down into this area. Much later, the way the Chinese traded with the Mesopotamians along the Silk Road, that they opened up the Karakoram Pass at a point of time and they started trading with India. It was far later that we learned about passes like Nathula, from where the trade would go right across Mansarovar down towards the Ladakh sky. So what I'm trying to say is that we have carried a different outlook vis-a-vis the other geocultural regions. Okay, and even if you look at the Mauryan Empire, or for that matter Gupta Empire, they were always focused onto the Hindu Kush. You look at the post-independent India, the first 4 big wars were largely territorial. Okay, so it is now that we are looking at the maritime context in a more profound manner, in a way is far more different than what we done in the ocean ancient times. Yes, of course, we moved along the seas. The Cholas moved towards the Far East, and here the Arabs traded with us. But that was largely based on trade, not conquest or other kinds of influences.
Tell us about the importance or lack thereof of maritime geography in ancient history.
Let me start from maritime geography and talk to you about, I'll come back to this, but I want to talk to you about what was just said about the Mauryan Empire and the Kautilian geographical construct. Kautilya is Chanakya's situation. This is the map. First of all, I want to show you a more contemporary map. This map, can you see this map? This is an equal area map of India superimposed upon Europe. And you can see that undivided India is almost the whole, it's almost equal to a coalesced version of Europe. Austria in this is one tiny little place about the size of Gurdaspur. And we seem to be obsessed with the 2 or 3 strategists who came from there. Now let's look at the Mauryan Empire. This is Chandragupta Maurya's empire, ranging, as the general said, from the Hindu Kush across to the Greater Himalayas and going all the way to the Bay of Bengal. This is the empire as it was expanded by Bindusara. This is the empire in the year 232 BC, 90 years later, which occupies the whole of India. How could this be done without diplomatic, informational, military, economic activity? None of our colleges, schools, military institutions are teaching this. None. So let me talk to you about India's maritime geography and compare it to China's. This is China's. This is a 15-inch isohyet. An isohyet is a line joining places of equal rainfall. You need 15 inches of rainfall to support an agricultural economy. This is China's. East and south of this isohyet lie the Han Chinese with per capita incomes of more than 20 to 50% higher than the mean. This is where they grow their agriculture. This is their situation currently. They are in grief. This is the reason why their own geography will not permit right now them to have a domestically driven economy. Therefore, as their economy demands ever-increasing resources of raw materials, they have no option but to go externally. But they are horrendously placed. They have about the worst maritime geography on the planet Earth. When China looks to seaward, it has no friends. It has only problems with straits, with countries that are inimical to it. This is a table showing you that 38% of Chinese imports and exports, 38% of China's GDP is driven by her imports and exports. So what is the value of India's maritime geography in comparison? We have one of the best maritime geographies in the world. But we're not doing anything with it. We have an island nation with no islanders. All the islanders are in the Indo-Gangetic Plain. China has a miserable geography, but is doing great stuff with it. Therefore, it is critical for us to appreciate our own maritime geography and to understand the role that geography plays in developing future and past events, which we now call history if they're in the past, and planning and strategy if they lie in the future. I do not agree that ancient history was preoccupied with the continental and not the maritime. It depends on how we define ancient history. If we look at the Cholas, they ruled in their area of the peninsula, not India, but for 1,500 years. In this period, they were dealing with the Song dynasty in China. They found that the problem with the Song dynasty's movement was with regard to the machinations of the Srivijaya Empire. They were appealed to by the Khmer Rouge, saying, not Rouge, but the Khmer kingdom, saying, come to my help. And they went to their help. It wasn't some foreigner coming to, once again, I want to dispel this particular myth. So ancient India had significant trade both east and west and south. It is only what we call relatively ancient India, which is medieval and beyond, where we forgot the imperatives of maritime trade. When you forget the imperatives of maritime trade, you ended up losing your littoral in one battle, which is really important as a battle, which we'll talk about hopefully tomorrow, which is the Battle of Diu. So people tell you that we lost our freedom because of this or that or the other. Actually, they never tell you why we lost our freedom. What you learn is, how did we regain our freedom? When did you last hear, how did we lose it in the first place? Did Clive of Plassey, ma'am, simply say, beam me up, Scotty, and landed up on the battlefield of Plassey? That didn't happen. We lost control over the hinterland, or over the littoral. Therefore, our hinterland became open. What's the enduring lesson we learned from ancient India, therefore? It is that any terrain that you neglect will get up and smack you in the face subsequently. Neglect the land, it will bite you in the nether regions. Neglect the sea, you will end up in the kind of situation that we did. So for India, ancient Indian history's lesson is balance. Find the balance between continental, geopolitical imperatives and trade, and maritime ones.
Come back to this concept of Bharatvarsh, the geographical contours, the cultural self-understanding of this unit that we call Bharatvarsh. To what extent do you think that has shaped the idea of an independent India? And do you really subscribe to the ancient palimpsest, the fact that there is an ancient layer and there have been layers after layers, where each successive layer has really not erased the essence of the previous, but has only added to it? So there's some kind of a composite culture which is built up. Your views on that, sir?
You see, it's a very interesting conflation of history that's taking place. On the one hand, Admiral Chauhan had talked about grand narratives. You see, every kingdom which rules has to say that it is doing something for a larger cause. Nobody can say that I want power because of power. Somebody says that I want power because I want to spread Christianity, I want to spread dharma, I want to, remove poverty, I want to, save the world. So there is always a narrative that is built up. The narrative that was built for a long time by the Britishers was that, look, you never had a land of your own. It's a geographical entity with so many warring people were there. But, the founding thought about India, if we go back to the Mahabharata, the very first verse is the verse between Dhritarashtra and Sanjay. And what is that verse? That is the verse in which he's asking, what, Sanjay, how are the battle lines drawn between my sons and the sons of Pandu? Now that's the opening line of the Mahabharata. And then he goes on to describe that, look, this is the array of armies. And on this side, you have the king of Hosala, you have the king of, Ayodhya. And in that description, you have 19 armies on the Kaurava side and 11 armies on the Pandava side, with 3 kingdoms which refused to take side, which included Kashmir, Udupi, and one more whose name I forget. Which shows that even at that point of time, not even at that point, but from that point of time, the concept that everybody from Gandhar to Cholas to Malayas to the Kamarupa kingdom, all those kingdoms, all those republics, all those armies were present in the battlefield of Kurukshetra. Now, you cannot think of something unthought of, even if it was pure imagination. In fact, I would go to the extent of saying that even if it was pure imagination, it's a great imagination. It's this imagination, and the first verse of Gita not only tells us about the sacred geography of this country, starting from Gandhar right up to Arunachal, it also lays down the norms of war, the ethics of war, and so many things. Therefore, India's defining notion is there even before that, because Mahabharata could not have, this whole imagination of Mahabharata could not have happened just by itself. It's not Aesop's fables. It's not like the Arabian Nights. So there is a real context to Bharat, being Bharat. And for a long time, it suited the Mughals, it suited the British to sort of say that all this were not really connected culturally. There's another very important aspect. One is the aspect of a nation being together because the nation has a common military or a common military strength. The other is that this is a nation because there is a common commerce that is happening. It is a common area because the norms, that is the dharma or whatever is described, that is being followed. So if we look at it from the point of culture, from the point of literature, from the point of Sanskrit as a unifying force, then the Mahabharata is a very important text, and that really places the present day Bharat also into a particular context. Because even today, those areas which are not described in the Mahabharata, we cannot claim a cultural or a geographic or an emotional context to those areas.
General Singh, we've been trying to understand China since the morning. And you've been in a key posting at the LAC right in the summer of 2020. Let's talk about India's strategic culture and then I'll go on to China. There is this understanding, and we can draw from stories of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, a very distinct strategic conduct of India in the interstate realm. So for instance, there is a definite opposition to formal alliances. We know that Ram, who was in dire need of help to save his wife Sita from Ravan, found the alliance with a dethroned, exiled Sugriv much more useful than a powerful Bali. You know, this idea of holding on to your strategic autonomy, the idea of having alliances with the weak is preferable to having alliances with the former, because if you have alliances with the former, you're actually putting your decisional autonomy at risk. There's also this idea of assisting rivals rival. So even in the Arthashastra, an enemy's enemy is a friend. And that's perhaps the bond between a Duryodhan and a Karan, that they had a common grudge in Arjun that brought them together. There is a very unique display of India's strategic conduct in the interstate realm. And if this can be traced back to something which we see as India's strategic culture emanating from some of these formative ideational texts that we're talking about, what are the specificities, or what do you think marks the uniqueness of China's conduct in the interstate realm? Something that you may have gleaned in your interactions with the commanders, both so at the grand strategic level and at the tactical level in your interactions with them. How are the notions of security coming from a strategic culture from the two Asian civilization different, if they are?
Our ancient texts definitely offer us a huge amount of philosophical wisdom. And as we all understand, that there are a large number of principles and frameworks that are offered to us over time. Those frameworks, whether they translate into blueprints to build strategic thought in the contemporary times, is, I would say, an area of exploration. Unlike the Chinese texts, which we all know, if you were to look at Sun Tzu, he draws in a lot of historical references, a lot of deductive reasoning to deal with contemporary times. So the broader difference between, if we were to say, between Arthashastra and what the Chinese thinkers relate to, is that we live more on principles and frameworks, whereas they are looking more at from a practitioner's perspective. So we often see that the Sun Tzu's texts have been reduced to those 36 stratagems, which we also now doing it. Whether that is right or not is a different question. But my point is that do these texts relate to contemporary times? And why I say that is for the reason that when we look at the notion of security, it is all about how a nation state looks at its security needs. In fact, it's a twin notion of a nation state and security. Well, the needs, you may fall short on the needs, or you may be surplus on that. Largely, you fall short on that. So therefore, I think when we look back at our scriptures or our texts, we need to ask a couple of questions. One, that we are looking for security for whom? For which values? I'm sure the texts offer that. But if we were to ask the text, or if we were to explore into the text and say, okay, fine, tell us, what threats are we looking at? What postures do we need to adopt now? or what resources are, how the resources have to be countered, what cost we need to pay for that, or how much time we have. So when we get down to these finer questions, I think these are questions of that blueprint. So whether those questions of that blueprint are answered by a text or not is one that we need to explore. So now, when we look, say, at our northern borders or western borders or the maritime context, I would say that the notion of security has to be more granular, much beyond the principal framework, much beyond the bigger ideas, much beyond these stratagems, much beyond these aphorisms that we have. And of course, we now live in a world where security is an expansive concept. Well, there was a time when we used to talk only about external or internal security. Then we added human security. Now we look at several dimensions of human security. Okay. And more so now we see that cyber has become a foundational layer to all levels of security. We now have space security and all that put together. So I think we need to move from principles more into the blueprint. And I think the Chinese are already there towards the blueprint side without maybe looking much at the principles. So it's about the first mile and the last mile position in that sense.
I open the floor for question and answers, and maybe you all could raise your hands, and maybe a mic could be given to you before you ask your question, please.
Ma'am, what is Meridian? Like you said about the Meridian geography.
Maritime.
Maritime.
It's the oceanic realm, the maritime realm. You know, the continent is land. Maritime is the ocean and the seas. The peninsular part of India is the maritime realm.
And my question is that we already know that India has had close ties with countries or civilizations like Persia and Mesopotamia and Egypt in the past. So what role do you think that these had in blurring this line between mythology and history?
Okay, thank you for your question. And I just wanted to use the time that I have to answer both your question and frame it in the question that was asked by the moderator about IMEC. IMEC has a series of problems with it. First of all is the letter ME. We should have called it West Asia. It's not Middle East for us. It's a pure continent, a pure colonial construct. But anyway, our government has said it, so we're forced to defend it. Is it, therefore, in line with your question about connections or maritime connectivity? It is. The maritime connectivity that India enjoyed and continues to currently progress is about a series of specific elements. What do you want to connect? Over what medium do you want to connect? Which are the entities that are going to flow on that medium? Are they going to be ships? Are they going to be data packets? Are they going to be both? What are they going to carry? Are they going to carry cargo? Are they going to carry human beings? Are they going to carry data streams? All of the above? What policies do you have? So when we come to policies and we come to the norms that govern us, then ancient India and its activities, as was brought out, they provide normative guidelines for India currently. And therefore, India continues to rely upon the acquired wisdom of these many, many millennia that have elapsed since the first movement of connections between Mesopotamia or Persia and the empires, the kingdoms that existed. I just want to end by saying one thing. If we're going to talk about maritime, if we're going to talk about this business of ancient India, I think it's really, really important to focus upon the Kautilian construct, because that's Mauryan construct. All these Guptas and all the various other kingdoms never went south of the Vindhyas. And therefore, you have an east-west orientation, but not a north-south one.
Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Anushka. I'm from Tashi Namgyal Academy, Sikkim. So my question is, as you mentioned earlier, like reading epics can help us in today's day in the form of ritual and personal life and maintaining peace and understanding. Ma'am, how is reading epics relevant in the present day and will be relevant in the future?
Thank you for the question. I don't agree I said that, whatever you read out, that epics is important to maintain peace. Did you say that? Just say that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. But I do think that the epics are extremely important. And I think that because Kautilya, who was writing his treatise, the Arthashastra, also thought so. So when Kautilya wrote his treatise, the Arthashastra, he was talking about a monarchical form of government where the head of state was a king, the monarch, the ruler. And book 1 of Kautilya's Arthashastra tells us how to train that ruler. Now you may wonder, what does the training curriculum of a ruler of the extent the modern empire was could possibly be? You would think of battlefield arrays, you could think of weaponry. No. His grounding was in what he calls Anvikshiki, which is the science of philosophy. Next were the Vedas, which also included the Itihas and the Puranas. So the monarch of this largest empire of its time had to have a grounding in the epics. And a lot of the strategic themes in Kautilya's Arthashastra, be it the sixfold foreign policy method, be it the Saptanga theory, which talks about the comprehensive national power of the state, be it about the concept of Rajadharma, Karma Yoga, all draws linearly from these epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, right? But very importantly, as General Singh pointed out, the epics tell us about the values. So the wars that were fought in the epics were called the Dharma Yudh because you were fighting for dharma, righteousness. And the wars which were documented later in later treatises like the Arthashastra or Kamandak's Niti Sar switched from heroism, Kshatriyahood in the epics to prudence and pragmatism, right? But the concept of dharma, the concept of forging a righteous war remained. And I think that sense of righteousness, that sense of judgment of the monarch came from his grounding in the epics. I hope that answers your question.
Hi, I'm Tamanna from Modern School Vasant Vihar from New Delhi. And my question is to Sir Admiral. I'm not sure if I'm making a relevant connection, but as you said, when we leave terrain or states or areas unacknowledged, or we keep giving them the shorter end of the stick, it ends up smacking us in the face. So do you believe that a similar situation may be created with all the disgruntlement in South India right now?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You hit the nail bang on the head. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you for the short response, sir.
Jain ma'am. Ma'am, I am Amulya Shivam from Sanjeev School, Bhagwanpur. And my question is that, ma'am, as you stated, that history is the factual documentation of facts. And don't you believe that mythologies are also documented in books like Ramayana and Mahabharata? Every evidences can be stated right now.
Well, I think, you see, what happens is that in a very general sense, what these two epics tell us, as was pointed out, that Kautilya wrote his Arthashastra, and so many things came up. The concept of governance, for example, it means that you have to have Raj Shakti, which is the power of the sovereign. Then you need the Mantrana Shakti, which is the power of the advisors, and you need the Utsaha Shakti, which is the general feeling, that everybody must be with you. So, in a sense, what these texts, what these epics tell us, they give us a foundational philosophy. Now, without this foundational philosophy, it is very difficult to govern yourself because you always have to look up to an ideal. As I said, no one has ever said that I want power for the sake of power. Everybody says that I want power, and that is the whole purpose of power. The purpose of power is not to be in power. The purpose of power is it's a means to an end. Now, that means to an end could be the prosperity of the people. That means to an end could be a strong military empire. That means to an end could be a strong cultural base. And a good nation is one in which all these are combined. You see, it is very easy to say that I'll be a strong military. You can't be a strong military, as was pointed out by General Singh here, unless you have a strong economy. So all these things are very closely interconnected. And when you observe these texts, when you observe the epics, then you begin to realize that there is a very strong interconnect between all these things.
I'd like to thank the gentlemen with me. It's been a privilege to be here sharing the stage with them. I think we've covered a broad spectrum of discussion from the ancient to the modern, from optimism to skepticism. Thank you so much.
Maybe on behalf of the panel, thank you for conducting it so well, for making us, think many questions which normally we may not have thought of. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will be as one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brother